Welcome to the Davenant Discussions podcast. I'm joined with Stephen Wedgeworth, and we are going to talk a little bit about a somewhat controversial topic, in vitro fertilization, for a number of reasons. One, the President of the United States recently gave an executive order privileging and promoting IVF. One of the well-known persons in his, I don't even know the right terminology, in his orbit of influence
His
is Elon
vibe
Musk.
zone.
Yeah, who someone can figure out the exact facts, but it looks like he has roughly 13 known children, many of whom are born via IVF, and he seems to really push that as a great solution, and I think it's connected to the infertility crisis in, well, the Western world in general. So I kind of wanted to start there just because it's kind of a big discussion, but we're hoping that the hot takes that are happening, maybe we can slow it down a little bit and go a little bit deeper in time and talk about the Nicene and Constantinopolitan Creed from 325 and 381, as well as the argument from the evangelical ethicist, Oliver O'Donovan. So I think that's kind of the summary where we want to go with this. So Stephen, did you mind maybe just introducing this executive order that came out yesterday from the White House?
Yeah, so on the campaign trail, Trump kind of surprised everybody by saying, oh, we're going to make in vitro fertilization totally covered by insurance. We're going to have a mandate for this thing. And people really, I had not heard that before. It was kind of out of left field. And so now he's acting on that promise. Now, his order doesn't go that far. It doesn't mandate coverage of IVF through conventional insurance. It's not clear what it is doing. It calls for looking into how to make it cheaper and potentially making it a benefit given to certain insurance policies. And it specifies military and government employees as one example of groups that the federal government might cover. But the general idea is promote in vitro fertilization, get it out there more broadly, and it even ties it into our national demographic crisis, that we're not having as many children as we once did. And so the assumption seems to be that this will be a good solution to that. This is one way to make America great again, to have more babies. But in this case, these are not going to be babies born out of a natural variety, but through the use of in vitro fertilization.
Make America fecund again.
Yes. And it ties into what you said, right? There's this bigger ecosystem in the conservative world, and also maybe not conservative, but in the sort of the Silicon Valley techno scene, where they are very worried about demographic drop and they want to increase births. It's sometimes referred to as pronatalism.
Yeah, there's kind of a well-known article, I think in like New York Magazine, about a couple who's promoting this pronatalism with all these kids. I don't know. It's a movement, and there's probably reasons for that. One is, I think if you can naturally procreate but choose to do it this way, there could be some benefits. For a while in the early thousands, there was a movement where womb leasing was very popular, and particularly out of India, other places I'm sure as well, but this is where it's kind of well known to have happened. And a couple of gametes would be donated, and a woman in India would carry the child in the womb, and then the parents would come and pick up the child. Eventually, it became regulated and controlled because of the abuses there. Now, it could be because a couple is infertile, or it could just be out of convenience that you would choose to do this. It is interesting to me. I want to say two things. I want to get to the Musk part, but the one piece I want to camp on just for a moment is the so-called infertility crisis that in Trump's executive order is mentioned. It's also something that Elon Musk frequently talks about. So I don't know if I'm reading into it. It feels like this is a very Musky executive order, but maybe I'm reading into it. There's something real there, but there's also another sort of more traditional conservative approach to children, and that is creating cities that are more family-friendly, tax structures that are more family-friendly, zoning that is more family-friendly. I don't know. By the way, I have no idea about the pragmatic effect of all of these, but it strikes me that there are at least other possibilities for how
Well, I think that's a really important angle. Maybe we can get to that in a little bit. If we are concerned about addressing a fertility crisis, is IVF the most effective way? And is it the most moral way?
That's
Those are
right.
technically different questions. But yeah, we could talk about that. Also, before we just totally say it's all about Musk, I do think it's important to say that evangelicals have not really thought about IVF. And on just a popular level, even though not that many people practice IVF, I mean, it's extremely rare that people would actually use IVF on a national level. Most evangelicals are likely to support it because they've never really looked into it. And they just think, well, it's helping people have babies, so what's the problem?
No, that's a really good point. When I've talked about IVF, it seems like I'm usually one of the first people, like if I give a talk or whatever, who does this because it's unusual. And it's probably worth just giving a moment of pastoral sensitivity. So some of my close friends have children through IVF. It's in all of the churches that I know of.
Mm.
Sometimes in very remarkable and very disastrous ways. Sometimes in very normal ways you wouldn't expect. So I don't think anyone here, and O'Donovan, who we'll get into, is clear on this. Everybody says, a child born worthy of honor, dignity, love, cherishing. I just want to say that up front because it could be that as we talk about some of the more bigger theological questions, that it may come across as we're being sort of critical of life. That's not at all, I think, what either of us would assume. And I only say that given how personal this question is.
Yeah, and of course, there's a difference between the public policy, the national conversation, and any individual family that might be considering something like this for themselves. Those are,
Those are two different questions, different applications. But it does strike me that not only is this executive order in the discourse now, I don't understand the full drama, but Elon Musk, I don't understand how it works, but he seems to have various women who have carried his children, and it's often through IVF or surrogacy, up to around 13. And he seems to be promoting this as good. And I think that already raises, I think even if you're not against IVF in any way, shape, or form, some of that should raise your eyebrows. So there's apparently outside of traditional marriage patterns, traditional love patterns where you're together and raising a child, he seems to be pursuing this IVF-centered births. And, that's interesting.
Yeah, with Elon, the news came out. It was either early this week or late last week that this conservative journalist and podcaster, media personality, she says that she has recently delivered Elon's child. Now, she didn't give specifics, didn't tell us how that went down. Certainly didn't say that they're married and living together as a family. That's not what's going on. And I think she worked for like the Babylon Bee or something, which gets a little bit sordid, I think, because the Babylon Bee played a part in Musk wanting to buy Twitter because they had been blocked or canceled for something. So Musk says, "You can't do that to my favorite, satire outlet. I'm going to come in," and then all of a sudden he's taking up with one of their writers or something. It's very odd. Yeah, it raises lots of icky questions about that kind of conservative media scene. Like, what is really going on here? But anyway, yeah, she mentioned that she's welcoming this child into the world, and it's Elon's. And as you say, it's however many children he's had now, a very high number through multiple women, and it does not appear to be, and how could it be, given who he is and the lifestyle he lives? It doesn't appear to be that he's going to have an in-person active presence with this woman and child. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case at all. It seems like, no, he's just spreading his genetics across. Perhaps he'll give them money. He's got money to offer, but it's not going to be a conventional family relationship. And so that is also important, that you can be pro-natalist without being pro-family.
I think that's hugely important. It's also a good segue into the argument of Oliver O'Donovan in Begotten or Made, because he makes this distinction in his book between the natural begetting process, which is an old-fashioned word which includes the whole deal, marriage, love, etc. Well, not necessarily marriage, but all that. And the idea of making life in a sort of laboratory IVF setting. And part of what this natural sexual relations, natural sexual difference, usually in the context of marriage or something like that, does for us is it creates sort of the material conditions for the family to flourish, the material conditions for there to be safety. In the modern world, it's a bit different, but in the pre-modern world, a woman who was pregnant needed a lot of extra help and protection, just in various ways. And so there's a whole connected thing. There's a spiritual connection that happens between two people. And there's also a connection through being either the wife or the husband, but together through pregnancy and through all of this that creates connections. Biologically, people talk about there being, what is the word? So an infant can understand, know the heartbeat of a mother, the smell of a mother, the voice of a mother, even in the womb. There's epigenetic factors that are transferred to the child in utero based on lifestyle choices and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting, even the husband, if you trace their testosterone levels, typically that'll change after you have a baby. As I understand, I'm not a scientist, but these are just things that I've read and seem to be pretty reasonable things. So someone listening who's in this field may have nuances here. So there is a biological change that happens to both father and mother, and there is a particular need that happens. But I also just think the material conditions of family and marriage have, if you look at any of the research, it seems to be like that's typically the best outcome. So not to be too pragmatic, but there's something that you're missing. If you're a child of a genetic dynasty from the ex-owner, your life outcomes will probably be significantly different than if you're a child of a steel fabricator with a marriage. So I think there's something important there.
Yeah, you mentioned O'Donovan, and he's probably still the best sort of Protestant take on this question. Now, Davenant has recently reprinted this, so you can get it now for a reasonable price, but it's not really a new book. It's been out for some time now. And the fact that he really is the main voice, it's good because he's very smart. He's a very accomplished, skilled thinker and writer, but it does also speak to the absolute scarcity of evangelical voices, right? There just aren't that many people that write about this well. Compare that to the Catholics, for instance, and Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, he authored an extremely substantial treatment of this question back in 1987. So, I mean, that was right when this was brand new technology. And it's pretty comprehensive, and that's kind of been the Catholic answer. They have that answer. But for Protestants, O'Donovan's there. But then once you get outside of the Tweedy set of us commentators into the broader Protestant world, who is it that has given guidance on this? Not much, not many. And some of the guidance is inconsistent. As you mentioned, it's not unusual to encounter the presence of people who have used IVF in our churches, and certain, fairly well-known evangelical writers have written in defense of the practice. So amongst those who have addressed it at all in Protestantism and evangelicalism, rather, there's not just one answer. There's a couple perspectives here. So it's hard to know how to respond, what to say about it. O'Donovan is interesting, though, because he cuts past a lot of the issues that probably we would want to talk about on the front line. The possibility of abortion happening here, fertilizing multiple eggs and then having to discard them. That's a huge problem with IVF, and also just how much it costs. I mean, that's what Trump's trying to get at, what it takes to make it happen. We don't even talk about that, right? But how do you even get to the materials that you're going to combine in the lab? Just a lot of questions there. But O'Donovan, he kind of passes through all of that, and he says, well, what if there was some perfect world, some fairy godmother could show up and just wave the wand, and he could get past all of those issues? What then? Would it be okay or not? His answer, he's very nuanced. He fields yes and no. His answer is generally No. I'm not sure if you disagree with me, if you think he leaves the door open a little bit, but his concern is that the use of IVF takes you away from the begetting of children in a natural human fashion into the making of children through artificial technology.
No, I think that's right. I think he's, as you noted, not talking about every single particular circumstance, but really asking the big question. I think he says, what is it you're doing when you're doing this? And you are bypassing the natural begetting process in order to make something. And it's interesting, he draws on the traditional biblical and theological language that distinguishes making and begetting. You can see this biblically really clear in the King James Version. If you read Genesis 1 through 5, for example, that God, creates or makes everything. But when it comes to childbirth, you see the word begetting used, and there's a transference of image. Adam transfers the image to his son through begetting, etc. That's the kind of normal language. By contrast, Eve, who's the mother of all living, in something like Genesis 4:1 says that I've gotten a child with the Lord. It's a different verb there, but that shows the agency of God there. And there's something important with that language that is mostly consistent throughout Scripture, actually, that is adopted into the Nicene Creed and the updated version of it in 381 at Constantinople, that distinguishes God, the Son of God, who shares the nature of a father because of natural begetting, and not because he's made. Then he would actually not share the same nature as the father. And this is actually an analogy based on human experience, because a cow begets a cow, and a human begets a human, and therefore God begets God. But if God makes something, he makes what is unlike him. And if I make something like a Lego, it's unlike me. And so the verbiage in the Bible, and then also in theological language, of begetting and making is a helpful distinction to show a continuity of nature, light from light, God from God, etc., between the Father and Son based on created analogies of human begetting. Now that might sound a little bit complicated, and forgive me for that, but I think if you're not familiar with the Nicene Creed, it's good to review that. Well, what's going on here in the Nicene Creed is that the early Christians are reflecting on what is everywhere normal and regular, this idea that natures beget natures, humans beget humans, and explaining that the Father and Son are consubstantial, they share one nature, through a relation of begetting, or eternal begetting, which is where we get the doctrine of eternal generation from, which distinguishes the Father from the Son through a relation of eternal generation. So this analogy from humans into the life of God that gives us theological language to describe the mystery of the Trinity is so important, not only in the distinction in Genesis between creation and begetting, but also in our theological language, that when you come to something like IVF, you sort of break the chain. Because in IVF, to simplify the version, often two external gametes from a male and a female are joined together in a laboratory setting, and a new life is made, divorced from the natural begetting process. So something about that is weird. That's more or less O'Donovan's argument. And I agree with you that he basically says in this fairy story, without any of these concerns, it's still not appropriate because you miss something really important through the natural begetting process.
Yeah, it's worth thinking about those expressions, begotten, not made. In the creed, it's, as you say, to secure the likeness of nature, the one substance, the identity and quality of the Father and the Son. With O'Donovan's book, he's moving from that to a human situation. The concern is not that something like IVF will render a non-human substance at the end of the day, but that we are failing to understand and treat this substance as properly human. that we're using the technique of making to something which deserves being begotten. That's the way he's arguing there. And that we are moving away from being properly human parents to being more like makers and creators over something under us. And you do have the language of playing God. So, instead of being properly human about this, we're playing God. And the people that are also included in playing God, of course, are the doctors and the scientists. So it's not the mother and father who are going to this technology. They're not the only, and maybe not even the primary people in danger of this. It's actually the people that they then give their materials to, so to speak, and ask those people to create this life. And towards the end of the book, O'Donovan, he actually has this pretty clever argument about if you wanted to sue your parents for bringing you into the world. And he explains why, that wouldn't be possible. But he says if you had an IVF case, you could imagine this experiment. And you're not only suing your parents for bringing you into the world, but you might sue the doctors and the medical providers for bringing you into this world. I thought that was a really interesting thought experiment there. The duties and relationships and responsibilities of those medical personnel to the children brought into the world this way.
Well, people often, Job, for example, will almost complain that he's been brought into this world by God. And
Right.
while that's ultimately true even in IVF, approximately, you can look at the doctors and the parental units, however they're defined, as the makers of you. And no longer do you have this mysterious infinite God whose deep and good providence you can throw your soul into, but now you have the technological apparatus of, the medical system of the United States of America or whatever to turn to and say, why did you make me this way? This will probably be especially more important once gene manipulation is more common. I guess to a degree it already is. If there are mistakes, you might blame or sue the doctor who didn't eliminate the wrong gene sufficiently or whatever. It's very messy in that sense.
Right. And an argument that Ratzinger makes, I'm not sure if O'Donovan makes it explicitly in his book. I would imagine it's consistent and he would agree with it. But Ratzinger's argument is that the conception of children is most appropriate and ought to be done within that marital bond of husband and wife. And it also ought to be done in some ways, in secret from within them and their own union. And that IVF actually takes it out. It's sort of like digging it out of the depths of the earth, so to speak, to use biblical metaphor, and then taking this item and putting it somewhere else and saying, okay, now you bring it together. You create the life here. Mm-hmm. And so it's taking something that ought to be very intimate, very private, very mysterious, and it's necessarily making it public. It's making it clinical. It's introducing other people into the conception of the child.
And I think there's also a keen distinction, like let's say you are infertile. Instead of, say, healing the organ that causes the infertility, you're bypassing the sort of natural healing process.
Yeah.
Which can't always happen, by the way, but sometimes it can. And using this technological means. There is, and I want to be careful, but the Bible does have many examples of infertile couples whose infertility was a way for God to deepen their faith. And I don't want to be cruel because I know that you can use that as a bludgeon. That's not how I mean it. But there could be something that we miss through bypassing the natural processes to jump to the technological solution, a kind of sturdiness to our faith that we might miss, since, as James clearly says in James 1, that the purpose of trials is to make our faith firm, strong.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those, I mean, that's why we have them. That's the purpose of trials, is to make your faith strong. So if you bypass trials through, and we do this all the time with money, and so it's not just applied here, but there's just something to that. So I think we have to ask those questions. At the same time, there's a lot going on. Instead of being begotten, not begotten and made of God, now they're begotten of a human and made of God. Now this child is unbegotten of a human and made in a laboratory. There's just weird things happening there. There is, through the mysterious private marital union that's now publicized and clinicized, as you said. There's interesting ethical things. Also, I would just say the third thing is, if you believe in natures, and natures are fulfilled by achieving their ends, the nature of the reproductive organs of humans are to reproduce naturally. If those are impeded or bypassed, it seems that we're achieving a result apart from our natural telos, purpose. And if you believe that natures are real and that purpose is real, that natures are real and that purpose is an actual cause, then you're actually missing out on something that is supremely good for you as a human. But God has made you this way. Now, that's if someone chooses to. I understand that some people don't choose to. It's for infertility, so there's lots of different things happening. When it comes to the public policy question, though, I wanted, before we run too far on time, you did mention that it might be worthwhile, because we're kind of focusing on the public policy side, thinking through the alternative ways to deal with the, what I would say, crisis of no babies. What did you have in mind there?
Well, I think first of all, we need to be honest about the situation. The press release when that Trump was making this announcement, he had his staff secretary, and I couldn't believe what I heard. I had to double check. Did he actually say that? And then he actually caught himself. He noticed that he'd made a mistake, but he said, and this is again just really worth thinking about more deeply why people would speak this way and what else is going on. He said these are treatments, speaking about IVF, these are treatments that have become unaffordable for many Americans. Now, he recognized, wait, whoops, that's a mistake. So he backtracked and he said, or have been unaffordable. But that's crazy. These have become unaffordable? Like, no, this is a procedure. First of all, it's only been in existence since the late 70s, early 80s, and it has always cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you do a quick Google, it'll say something like between $6,000 and $12,000, but that's only for one fertilization attempt, and usually it takes many fertilization attempts. And I was just looking through a couple of journal articles on this, and in the 90s, it was routinely the case that it was over $100,000 just for one sort of cycle of IVF treatments. And they noted that there have been cases where it was $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. That's in the 90s. So this idea that it has become unaffordable, that's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. This has always been an outrageously expensive procedure. And so if we're going to say now the promise is to make this universal, like make everybody's healthcare cover it, make your lawyers cover it. I mean, this is Obamacare times a million. This is nuts on the economic level. And is this the reason that Americans are not having children? Is this the reason? Because they want to do IVF but can't afford it. That's why we have a population crisis? Like,
No way.
come on, guys. Come on. You know that's ridiculous. As soon as the press secretary said it, he knew it was ridiculous, but it's political jargon, it's rhetoric. Why are people not having kids? Like, that's the real question. Yes, when there are cases of infertility, we need to be really conscious and we need to mourn with those who mourn. We need to help those people walk through that. But that's not the national issue here. That's a local, personal, pastoral issue. That's not the national issue. And talking about public policy like that is weird. It's very strange. Why aren't we having kids? Because people don't want to. That's the problem nationally. People don't want to. And so IVF, I mean, this is only going to be something that a very small number of people take advantage of, even if it's there. So let's have this conversation. Also, again, if you can't have children, and I know people who can't, and it's a terrible burden, all the questions that they subject themselves to, I mean, they're their own hardest critics, right? Because it's going through their mind. What are other things that could be done for them? So people that want to have kids but can't, what can be done for them? And then the people that could have children, but choose not to, what could be done for them? What's happening there? I mean, these are the questions I think that a public policy should really be looking into. On those who are infertile but want kids, well, I think there are lots of candidates for adoption, and that's an extremely expensive procedure, right? That's a complicated, hard thing. So, how to make it to where people who can and would qualify to be adopted parents can do that well, that could be a conversation to be had. Would still be very hard, would have lots of moral considerations. It's not a panacea, but that's something we could talk about. And then why aren't people having children? Like, that's the big question in the room.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is choice. I mean, there's a silly phrase that's dual income, no kids. Anyways. And I think there is a lot of choice. Part of the choice is that family life does seem unattractive compared to other things. Arguably, the whole Elon Musk thing is sort of a choice not to have children in a typical family experience with all the responsibilities and duties that brings with it, and to kind of outsource part of that in the sort of efficiency mechanical way. So it's interesting that IVF, in this narrow case, is almost a way to sort of not be pro-life. Not in other cases, of course, but
on the national policy level,
yes,
IVF is one more piece of sort of techno-capital elite policy. We need to be really clear about this.
Like, why not make adoption affordable under Medicare or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, IVF has never been and will never be the choice of the average NASCAR viewer, right? It might be the top NASCAR driver. He might take that choice, but the viewer, this is not going to be their thing by and large. This is not a working class populist initiative. It's not really scalable, and that just needs to be
right. And there are some places, like I think in Denmark, if I understand correctly, it's kind of covered by medical care. But then the population's tiny, and they often have children. I think at older ages, there might be reasons for that. But yeah, I think the bigger questions, even, I know this is kind of a generalization, but even the structure of life almost requires you to delay family, just how long education works, how long it takes to get enough money for just supporting rent for a 2 or 3 bedroom place to house the kids. It takes longer than it used to. At the same time, like, how shall I put this sensitively? I think people can afford kids. They just have to live on less. Just don't buy alcohol, never eat out, don't own a car.
Yeah. No.
Like stuff like that. But
this is really important. So some people will say we can't afford it. That's the issue. And so then conservatives will respond with, well, let's make it affordable. Let's have a pro-family economic policy. I definitely went through a few years where I was pumped about this. But again, reality is really hard. You know, I used to live in America's 51st state, much like, like Wyatt here, he finds himself in Canada. I used to live in Canada. I was in British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
British Columbia has really good family support systems from the government.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the health care is covered through taxes. It's standard to get paid maternity leave. You just get a check in the mail from the province of British Columbia for every child you have. Like, it's for an American, like, what? Like, I just open up my mailbox and there's several $100s and I have another kid and I get more. That's what they do in BC. I don't know if that's the same in Ontario. And they also give you a stipend for private schooling and homeschooling. Like, if you want to do that, they'll give you money for that. And BC is having its lowest number of natural births ever right now.
Yeah, that's one of now, the one minor piece of context I would add, though, is that the city of Vancouver and Toronto is legitimately unaffordable for any average family. So
sure.
I think I would say there's a balance. I agree with what you just said. I think you're 100% correct. The caveat is, in some of these major cities, like in Vancouver, a one bedroom place is probably like $2,800 a month, and a 2-bedroom place is like over $3,000. So there is a real sense in certain circumstances it would probably be impossible to have kids in these mega cities. So I just want to make sure I say that. But this is not
That's
the
fair.
norm in most of Canada or in the United States when you're living outside of these mega metropolis. Like Like, I lived in Louisville, Kentucky for years, and I don't want to say the numbers, but like I had pretty normal paying job. I could afford a house and 2 cars, like, and it wasn't like this highfalutin job. It was very middling.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of smaller towns, medium-sized cities where it's, yeah, you can't eat out. You have to sacrifice that. You can't buy 200 bottles of wine and whiskey to sacrifice that. You can't buy a new car. You buy used, but it's not. It's not as difficult as people make it sound. It is as you noted earlier, it's a choice. Or you use different language, but choice was the idea that you were communicating.
So it's true that, Vancouver and Toronto, these are big cities, but look at other countries that have the same situation. Hungary is now reporting low birth rates again. They thought they had turned it around. They haven't. It is a problem. It's a crisis. And yeah, you're right. It's not just because of money. It's lifestyle. And it's not only like individual consumer choice. So I want to be pushed back a little on that too. It's not like, oh, the kids these days, they can't go without their avocado toast, that kind of line. That's not the problem either. You have to think about it. What is the social vision of just normal life, like ordinary life? Well, you're supposed to have a car for sure. Probably in America, you're supposed to have 2 cars. And then think about the cars. Well, if you have a normal car, 2 seats in the front, 3 in the back, you probably really are only going to put 2 kids in there because you got to have room
seats.
for
Yeah, for
car
sure.
seats, for bags, everything else. So if you want to have a 3rd kid, well, now you're in SUV or minivan territory right away. So that's an issue. And then what do we expect for our living arrangement? I'm not knocking some of these expectations, but typically we want a house. We want a detached house, maybe a yard. Well, how do you do that in city environments as you grow population wise? It's a challenge. We move away from our parents now. So we don't have grandparents. We don't have aunts and uncles. So we really are kind of on our own here. And these are challenging features of a social system. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying we are all selfish pigs and that's why we do this. Now, this is just the world we live in. We've moved from an agricultural society to an urban industrial society. Our expectations of a house and where to live and what our local community is like and just how we are is very different. And it is not very compatible with a family based on older traditional models. I mean, that really is the big challenge we're dealing with.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes you find parents charging their 18, 19, 20-year-old kids rent, and it creates this expectation to get them out of the house eventually. But you're like, all throughout history and even across the world today, multi-generational housing is the norm. It's becoming again in Canada the norm because of the cost of things, which is really interesting. I think that's a problem.
Well, I think about my own upbringing, right? I grew up in a semi-rural environment. We weren't like way out in the middle of nowhere, but the local town had about 10,000 people, and we were outside of that town, But my dad, so I grew up in the house of my parents. Well, he just moved, I don't know, a couple hundred yards from his parents. And they themselves had moved just a few hundred yards from their parents. And, that whole plot of land was just Wedgeworth family land. It had been kind of in the family for as far back as anybody could really remember. And then by contrast, what do? I take up stakes and I move 100 miles and a little bit later 1,000 miles and 3,000 miles. Now I'm back closer to that 1,000-mile range again, but I'm not there. Just that action is so transformative and disruptive. And that's normal now, right?
It's normal now. The stability isn't there. The familial help isn't there. And we've had someone in our church kind of take a grandmotherly role because the grandparents are far away as well. And there's some ways church life can actually bridge that gap. I would also add the expectations of men and women have changed so much that the sort of value of the maternal role at home opposed to career and work. There's a different value system that makes it less attractive. I don't want to say too much about that because I think people on both sides are kind of wrong on how they approach this. In fact, historically, men and wives work like the entire time. Like that's been the norm.
Well, it's tied into the previous point.
Never
historically, staying at home didn't mean that you didn't go to work.
Yes, you worked at home. Yes.
You
So that's
were
a stay-at-home
you
person was a worker, right?
Yeah, your home was where work happened. It was a productive area. And I do think that's a good way that we can go forward, is to try to make our zones of production and our zones
I
of
think so.
life and residence, make those much more closely connected and intertwined. But that's not so easy, right? We can't all just have the small family farm. We're going to have to think a little more, a little more
Creatively.
carefully about how it's going to work in the modern era. And a lot of the language that you see in the ressourcement conversation as well, okay, Aristotle teaches us that women are domestic and men are political or something. Again, domestic back in those days often meant like a small scale social economy.
Small
You had a
business kind of
household,
thing.
you had domestic servants, you might have livestock, you might actually be, you might be mining, you might be producing textiles, you might be doing dyes. I mean, there's all kinds of industry that could be going on there. And then the political man, he's like going out to a foreign land to fight and probably die, right? That's the kind of contrast there. And so when we think about these categories, we have to be careful to apply them in the right way. And so staying at home today is not the same thing as being a domestic overseer in the
That's right.
ancient world. So we have to ask those hard questions, and what do we do with that? Now, I still think the modern social economy is very opposed to a healthy human household.
Agreed. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. Even though I was saying this, I wasn't. So we have a homeschooling family, and I'm all for that. But I do think the imagination that woman stays at home and just kind of does nothing is sort of a made up modern thing.
Yeah.
You would be essentially co-workers. If you're agricultural, you'd be co-workers. You would just do different jobs in proportion to the
Yeah.
kind of human that you are.
And none of the pro-family proponents would say the woman stays at home and does nothing.
No, no, no,
That's
no.
the
Yeah,
criticism. That's
true. Yeah,
antagonists.
you're right. Yeah,
But there is still this assumption that, okay, if the woman stays at home, like she's literally in the physical building of the house, right? There's
yeah,
kind of that thought, or she's in the yard. Whereas there would have, in ancient older world, again, she would have been like involved in the actual industry of the family that then is their livelihood. And so if we don't have that coming out of the home anymore, then the whole conversation and dynamic is very different. And so, yeah, these are avenues to pursue. How can you make having children and having a family more consistent with modern life? And maybe this is a two-way street, right? We want to address the modern life that makes the family life so hard and unappealing to some people. But we also want to say, well, what does the family life look like, and how does it fit in with that modern life better? I mean, that's a really interesting thing to talk about. There's a writer named Alan Carlson who was at Hillsdale for many years. He talks a lot about this, home-based economies, productive households, and modern technology in some ways can be a friend because you can work from home. You can use Zoom and other methods to be able to communicate work way from home. But it also brings new challenges because if you work from home, you might still not be doing a good job with your family, even though
yeah.
you're literally in the house. Yeah.
No, it doesn't solve the problems. Well, I think we maybe should kind of wrap this up. I mean, the big picture, there was the executive order that promotes IVF. Interesting, the Musk connections. I think at the big picture policy level, you're right to say that IVF is not the problem for the population crisis that we're having. To be blunt, it's largely choice, although it is connected to real social transformations that are not
Yeah.
you shouldn't ignore. If you're living in Vancouver, you may not literally be able to afford an apartment there. You might have to move to a different place in the world. Maybe New York City is the same. I'm not sure exactly, or LA
Yeah.
City.
No, I think these would be an interesting thought if you were a dynamic politician who just wants to shoot for the moon and say crazy stuff all the time, right? So let's pretend such people exist. What if we just started creating more cities in America, right? Because why is America more livable with a family than Canada? Let's just say that's generally true right now. Why is that the case?
I can answer that question. It's actually more cities, in part.
Yes, there's more places to
I
go.
should clarify, more medium-sized cities where the
Yes.
cost of living and the quality of life hasn't. Yes.
Right.
Like,
I'm in a town that's got about 100,000, and then there's a town right next to it that's got about 100,000. And so it's a decent sized population area, but it's not a metropolis, right? And there's many of these places all over America. You don't have to only live in the giant million-person city or out on the homestead in the farm. Like, there are other options. Can we make more places to live? And can you live closer to where you work? So if you don't work from home, at least it doesn't take you that long to get back and
That's
forth.
the real problem. The place that you can afford is an hour away commute. But the interesting
Yeah.
part is we're building small cities that are actually suburbs around the work hub, and so it is actually exasperating the problem. Yeah, honestly, I think founding new cities of 20 to 100,000 everywhere is like would be a huge win. But
Yeah.
again, I don't actually know what that would mean practically, so maybe I'm speaking poorly. But
Yeah. Well, you got to have the industry, right? You got to have something for people to do that employs them. But yeah, I think these are kind of political questions to have. And then on the personal level, this is going to come down to values, convictions, what we believe in. And this is where our Christianity, I think, is so essential. At the end of the day, why should we have children and families? Because it's good. All right, this is what God wants for us. It's not good for man to be alone. Be fruitful and multiply. Take dominion over the earth and subdue it. The union between man and wife is natural, but then God sanctifies it by making it a sign of Christ and the church. And the relationship between parents and children, in some ways, as you have mentioned with O'Donovan, harkens back to just God's own nature, that God is a generative being. And so we do this because we believe that it's the right way to be. And then we trust that God is going to give us what we need to continue with it, to find our fulfillment, not in it in its own sake, but ultimately being fulfilled in Him as we do these things faithfully.
I think that's exactly right. And that feels like a very pastoral way to close our discussion. So thank you, Stephen. That was great.
You got it.